Arguably, the essence or foundation of Buddhist teachings is the Four Noble Truths. Many other teachings can be seen as specific instructions or elaborations on how to live in accordance with these truths. As a collection, they can be understood as a comprehensive framework for addressing the fundamental issue of life, which is suffering, and revealing the path to liberation from it. With each sutta or list of precepts serving as a formula for this profound truth. It's worth noting, however, that the Buddha typically did not begin his teachings by introducing the Four Noble Truths. In the context of Buddhism during his time, these truths were considered more advanced teachings. Though not necessarily secret or exclusive, and the Buddha imparted them to lay people as well. But they were not his initial or even secondary teachings. Instead, he often started lessons with foundational concepts like generosity, which is practiced in the form of giving and service to others. Another important aspect he emphasized early on were the dangers of indulging in sense pleasures and worldly attachments as part of a regular lifestyle, which he explained was the primary cause of suffering that arises out of ignorance. For instance, in the Upali Sutta, when the Buddha was teaching a householder who was not a monk but relatively new to his teachings, he started his lesson by introducing the practice of generosity. Then he would explain virtue, or sila, and eventually emphasize the detriments of entertaining sense pleasures and mental attachments. And those dangers lie in our tendency to become fascinated and addicted to the allure of beauty in everything and the pleasures we experience in the physical world. This preoccupation with things that are visually beautiful or otherwise sensual are the main obstacle that distract us from the activities and actions that are more wise and meaningful in life. The sensual life is also a lifestyle that still causes a great deal of harm to everyone, including ourselves, even when we're not criminals. And finally, after having explained the consequences of sensual life, as well as the benefits of renunciation and meditation and such, he would explain the formula of the Four Noble Truths. Now, regarding the wording of the title, Four Noble Truths, many scholars believe that it's not an ideal translation of the Pali phrase, since they essentially explain that it's not the truths themselves that are noble, but that only people who are of noble spirit, people of virtue who are pure and can live according to these truths are noble. And in fact, these truths are called truths because they are fundamental realities or laws of existence. Now, the Buddha's first sermon is perhaps the most well-known descriptions of the Four Noble Truths. The term first sermon is somewhat misleading, as it's very unlikely that the initial discourse the Buddha had with his earliest followers resembled anything of the comprehensive sermon that we have today, just because of how much was added onto it later. But nonetheless, at its core, the Four Noble Truths remain unchanged. The first truth states that the nature of existence is suffering, which for all sentient beings is inevitable. In the context of the Noble Truths, dukkha is the term for suffering, and it can also mean distortion or delusion. He explains that suffering occurs during birth, illness, aging, death, as well as the experience of pleasurable sensations, the loss of pleasurable sensations, and the inability to obtain what one wants. On top of this, it's also taught that this suffering perpetuates with constant rebirth within the 6 realms of life due to the 5 aggregates of clinging, which are psychological, but also elements found in nature. Dukkha encompasses suffering in all of its forms and severities. So scholars also understand it to often mean unsatisfactoriness. And that's a very appropriate term too, because for many of us who have the luxury to watch a video presentation or listen to a lecture, the kind of suffering we experience in first world countries is primarily just inconvenience and dissatisfaction. So dukkha includes the unsatisfactory nature of existence, which is that we never truly get what we want. Of course, physically or in terms of accomplishments, we often do get the things we want, but oftentimes we realize that we chose the wrong thing, or it wasn't what we expected, or we get used to it after a while and get bored. So that sense of dissatisfaction persists. This is especially noticeable as time goes by. We get that latest iPhone, or DSLR camera, or car that we've been saving up for. We enjoy it for a bit, but then, oh, what do you know? Another iPhone comes out. One that's supposedly better. Or a next level Canon EOS camera comes out with 60 megapixels. But your trusty lenses are no longer compatible with the lens mount. Or you realize that your car isn't reliable and is costing you hundreds of dollars every couple of months to maintain it, ad infinitum. All of us are familiar with this kind of feeling of constant dissatisfaction. But I think most of us aren't that fazed by it because we always just turn our attention to the next indulgence before becoming too unhappy. Now, he also adds briefly in the end that the 5 aggregates of clinging perpetuate our suffering. The 5 aggregates are known as the 5 skandhas in Sanskrit. Other terms used in Buddhism include samsaras or khandhas, which are plural pronunciations of those terms. And that's because these are technical terms I've explained in introductory presentations that are, in short, these vast collections of mechanical aggregates or defects that filter and condition consciousness and give humans and creatures what we know as a subconscious or instinctual animal mind. We have so many of these aggregates in our mind, and there's so much of it that we identify with them and unknowingly define ourselves by them. At any rate, all things within existence inevitably pass, so the things we obtain are never reliable. That's another reason why even when we're not experiencing a lot of physical or emotional or crude suffering, dukkha continues to pervade our lives because we are dissatisfied. At the same time, we accrue karma when we feed desire, and that's the component that makes life truly painful and turbulent. The second noble truth states that the cause of this intrinsic suffering, which is called samudaya, meaning arising, referring to suffering that arises from a particular cause, the cause of this suffering is craving, or tanha in Pali. Tanha is also translated as thirst. The mental states of craving and aversion lead to suffering because they perpetuate insatiable desires and attachments to impermanent things. And if one wants to go deeper, the ultimate cause of suffering is ignorance of this and of cyclic existence. Various philosophies and major religions share this idea that life in some way or another falls short of offering complete happiness and satisfaction. It certainly isn't a concept that is exclusive to Buddhism, but what Buddhism teaches about the cause of the unsatisfactory nature of life is very specific. The Buddha explains in the first sermon that the origin of suffering and unsatisfactoriness, quote, is craving which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there, that is, craving for sensual pleasure, craving for existence, craving for extermination, end quote. So among the more obvious forms of craving, he mentions that we also crave existence, which is to say that we have the desire to stay young and live forever so that we can continue to entertain our other cravings. And at the same time, there are plenty of those who have a similar but opposite craving, which is the desire for non-existence or death. Now, there is a very precise mechanical process in nature that is constantly working within our subconsciousness and producing these consequences and dukkha, both mentally and manifesting in the physical world. It begins with ignorance of the first noble truth and is perpetuated by our indulgence in pleasures. The stages of going from desire to suffering or from desire to satisfaction are part of a terrific and elaborate process known as transmigration, which is the evolution and devolution of a soul as it passes through the various kingdoms, phylums, and genuses of nature over the course of millions of lives. Now, about recognizing the unsatisfactory nature of existence, it takes some experience and very thoughtful reflection to realize that this intrinsic law is the very reason why we are constantly struggling in this state of pursuing happiness, but never sustaining it for long or for good. Because in reality, we are constantly diverting our attention to the next stimulating thing. The next Game of Thrones episode, the next paycheck, the next weekend, the next career advancement, the next big project, etc. So in order to maintain awareness and austerity in the first and second noble truths, we study the Dhamma and we practice daily exercises like self-observation and retrospection or analytical meditation. The third noble truth asserts that there is a solution to end suffering. The cessation of suffering is called nirodha, which by itself means cessation. The more popular and familiar term nirvana also means cessation, but it tends to refer to the state of consciousness or dimension nirvana. Scriptures related to the third truth teach the various practical methods and steps to end suffering, which generally involve service to others and the removal of mental aggregates that produce craving and attachment. So, in this truth of cessation, it states that in spite of the perpetual suffering in existence, there is a way to end it in all of its forms, including the lingering of unsatisfactoriness, and the method is precise and universal and not arbitrary or accidental or exclusive to certain kinds of people. It is also a solitary work in that each being is fully responsible for their own spiritual growth. So it's impossible to get others to do the great work for you. And likewise, in most cases, you can't pay somebody else's karma for them. So, the solution to suffering is the renunciation of desire, which in a broad sense includes aversion or fear. In the first sermon, the Buddha says that the cessation of suffering, quote, is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up of and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, and non-reliance on it. End quote. So with proper practice, we must eliminate our desires and leave not even a small amount remaining. Finally, the fourth noble truth states that the method that leads to the cessation of suffering is the noble eightfold path, also known as the middle path. This is called the magga in Pali. The steps of the Eightfold Path consist of universal observances and mental practices that are founded on cosmic ethics. These steps are universal in that they can be implemented on any planet and in any galaxy. The path consists of a few aspects which are wisdom, that is to say, right view and right intention, ethics, which include right action, right speech, right livelihood, and meditation, which requires right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, hours can be spent in explaining or learning about the Eightfold Path alone. It's an area of Buddhism that certainly deserves its own presentations. My lesson, Meditation and the Eight Limbs of Yoga, provides detailed instructions on what we can consider the Hindu equivalent to the Eightfold Path. The fundamental principle here is cosmic ethics. Everything we do in our daily life should be approached with the right attitude and perspective. And some habits have to be dropped altogether. We must study ourselves and utilize meditation regularly in order to comprehend the nature of life and be able to commit to an ethical lifestyle. When we take on this responsibility, we learn to work with the superior laws of nature so that our actions perpetuate beneficial results for everyone, as opposed to results that simply degrade one's conscience or influence people in a degenerative way. As for the noble truths in general, it's safe to say that we can view these cosmic laws as practical tasks, each one requiring both some intellectual understanding as well as visceral comprehension that we get from personal experience or contemplation, that is, in this context, meditation. The Four Noble Truths are the essence of Buddhist teaching. With them can be found all of the other teachings Buddhism provides. All the suttas, stupas, sermons, and so forth are elaborations of the Four Noble Truths. And within these scriptures, there are many interesting philosophical and psychological insights. Advice to lay people, those who live a more ordinary household life, comments on the nature of the cosmos, teachings about the basic functions of nature and of animal behavior. Many discussions that we can consider scientific, such as evolution and taxonomy, but all of which are a service of the Four Noble Truths. This is believed to be what the Buddha talked about in his first sermon, the one written after he attained enlightenment, and it marked his initial formal address to his fellow companions who were dedicated to rigorous asceticism. The Buddha had once practiced this extreme form of asceticism himself, but he eventually abandoned it upon realizing how unnecessary and restricting and difficult it was. And previous to his asceticism, he also had abandoned the comforts of worldly life, understanding that the lifestyle of pursuing desires and indulgences was superficial and incapable of providing any profound insight into the existential condition of humans. It was after these two lifestyles that the Eightfold Path, the middle path, was discovered to be the best way to liberation between the two extremes of austere asceticism and ordinary sensual household life. And there are another set of two extremes that we'll get to in a moment. The Four Noble Truths and the middle path together are profoundly integrated. The fourth truth is the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path contains practices that allow one to perceive the reality of the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha composed these formulas in a methodical and beautifully concise way. When this formula is read by Westerners, it's not uncommon for some people to struggle with believing even in the first noble truth, which asserts that life contains inevitable suffering, because there is the assumption that certain people and animals suffer, but not everyone. The basic principles like change and rebirth are not taken into consideration, though. So this interpretation of the first truth is very superficial and incomplete, because the Buddha's teachings explicitly mentions the primary forms of suffering that are inescapable if one does not follow the Dhamma. These are birth, illness, aging, and death. In one sense, we can be fortunate to live to old age, but at the same time, aging is a form of sickness. All the functions of the body and brain are in decline: hearing, sight, the immune system, muscle growth, thinking, and memory. So inevitably, after a person ages enough, they face a lot of physical and mental decline. Now let's look at the relationship between death and the Four Noble Truths, since death is not considered the solution to the end of suffering in Buddhism. It's a fundamental Buddhist understanding that death is not the end of life for any creature. Death is not the cessation of suffering. It's not the solution. To explain this, let's summarize the Four Noble Truths. First, we have the truth that there is suffering, meaning that suffering is inherent to existence. It implies that at some point in life, you will experience physical or mental pain. Then there is the second truth, which is that craving is the cause of suffering. But if we investigate deeper into craving, we find that the reason we experience craving in the first place, and attachment in the first place, is because of ignorance. And true to the teachings, the ultimate cause of suffering is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. The third noble truth tells us that there is a solution to end suffering. And the fourth truth states that the solution to suffering is the Eightfold Path. So the means to the end of suffering is not something that occurs randomly, accidentally, or exclusively to certain kinds of people. There are steps one has to follow. The Buddha is also very adamant that enlightenment is a phenomenon that always happens at an individual level. It's not something that's supposed to occur in groups of people at once. In today's secular society, in which people only trust scientific evidence or proof to be convinced of anything, when we come across the Four Noble Truths, we may have some resistance to the first truth, the truth of suffering, and may be tempted to think that with the advancements in science, we could potentially eliminate things like diseases and cancer, particularly heart disease, and comfortably live to 100 years on average or more, and then peacefully pass away and leave all of our worries behind. And from this perspective, suffering would no longer be a significant issue. But again, this is the wrong attitude, because the Buddha's intention with the Four Noble Truths was to induce the profound awareness that all of the suffering that occurs in life happens within an existence that is cyclic. It doesn't end after death, and it never will end unless you do something about it. To comprehend that and live according to these fundamental cosmic principles is the sole purpose of Buddhism. So people who adopt some of the philosophies and practices of Buddhism, typically the ones that suit their needs or interests, but disregard the Four Noble Truths, are not truly practicing Buddhism. What they are practicing is mysticism, because they're not living by the essential laws of the Dharma, laws such as service, sacrifice, elimination of defects, and living in such a way that they're cognizant of rebirth and death and karma. Some people have the idea that the continuation of consciousness after death is just metaphoric and something that only people from the time of the Buddha took seriously. This concept of symbolic rebirth is deeply mistaken. That meaning was never the intention of the Buddha, of the suttas. And there's no requirement to believe or accept everything as a practicing Buddhist. There's no declaration of faith, but to disbelieve or remain unaware of the fact that rebirth and recurrence are inextricable from the Four Noble Truths is to set yourself up for failure that will unfold in the form of conscious deterioration. The problem of suffering is the most severe problem because it is a phenomenon that only occurs within the sphere of existence. Any imaginable place or dimensional plane carries the potential for suffering, so the only way to end suffering is to stop existing. This means to somehow move outside of the realms of existence. And again, to die is not to stop existing, unless you believe in nihilism or annihilationism, which is essentially the belief that everything ends and nothing remains after death. All life, perceptions, sensations, sense of self just end completely. And the Buddha discussed the annihilationist belief during his time, and it was a common belief. This is another reason why the Eightfold Path is called the middle path, because it's a perfectly balanced method to happiness between the two extremes of asceticism and ordinary sensual life. And I would say that the widespread secular, materialistic, atheistic belief that nothing happens after death is somewhat of a recent phenomenon in the West that probably arose around the beginning of the 20th century. Christianity has become obscure with all of its different denominations and schools that, at least in Canada, maybe not so much in the States, people just so easily reject the existence of God or heaven or hell because of how fantastical and irrational the statements in the Bible seem. We automatically assume the materialistic, scientific point of view because we don't have anything else to refer to. We don't recognize spiritual or divine appearances or presence. Nobody knows what that is, so most people don't feel as though they've had any personal experience with divinity. We only trust what can be proven in numbers and statistics. One common criticism against religion is that it has generally promoted the wishfulness to conquer death. Outside of Gnosticism and Dharma, religious thought in general grapples with the fear of death through beliefs like total annihilation, or in an opposing way through comforting but erroneous concepts about the afterlife. This critique may be effective for many Western religions, particularly Christianity and some other theistic belief systems. But Buddhism doesn't champion a strong enthusiasm for life after death, nor does it handle death from a place of fear, since these two states of excitement and fear are polarized psychological states that must be avoided on a regular basis in order to train the mind to be still and neutral, as this prevents rebirth. So as stated before, in Buddhism, the major issue with death is that it doesn't lead to the cessation of suffering. Death is just a short break, a momentary transition from one life to another. So if this is a possible truth, would you risk your physical and mental comfort by assuming that nothing will happen after death? Well, with certain branches of Christianity, if you believe in Jesus, you will be accepted into heaven forever. So there is no problem of suffering after death. And with annihilation, again, there are no issues with suffering. Whether you're suffering or not, everything will be easier after you die and cease to exist. Nothing else happens after that, everything ends. So there is no problem of suffering after death unless the belief is false. Buddhist thinking is radically different. The very problem Buddhism has is existence itself. What happens after you die? How will you exist? What will the quality of your life be? These are the questions it raises. Because if you consider the state of annihilation after death, how would you be able to know this? You are annihilated. You would no longer have any conscious perception. How would you be able to confirm to everyone else that this is how everything finishes after death? You can't have personal insight into nothing. You can't have a revelation about death and perceive nothing. So it's only through some kind of continuation of consciousness after death that you could possibly claim knowledge about this. So in Buddhism, the motivation to end suffering is not the expectation of heaven or the fear of death. The motivation is existence itself, because suffering is intrinsically connected to life. The only solution to this is outside the condition of existence. That is the only place where suffering does not exist. If we go through the four truths again, suffering is intrinsic to life because all life is subject to endless change and stress. So that first law of suffering due to endless change right there is opposed to the idea of an eternal heaven or hell after death. The functions of nature as described by Buddhism are completely congruent with physics. Even the fantastical human psychic powers such as remote viewing, prophecy, or transference of consciousness are nowadays much more legitimate and believable because of our discoveries in quantum physics. But at a more fundamental level, the Buddhist conviction of basic processes like evolution and rebirth is perfectly congruent with scientific laws like the law of conservation, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, which states that any system or living thing that is made up of elements or compounds must work together in an organized and superior way in order to keep the system or organism going. Entropy also states that systems and things are subject to the eventual decay and disorganization of elements or compounds. This is the law that puts an end to all the cycles and living things in nature. So for there to exist an eternal heaven or hell in which the beings there exist forever would violate the basic laws of the universe. Now, having said that, Buddhism does have the concept of heaven and hell, and they are taught as real, literal places that beings experience and live in. They are not to be mistaken for symbols or metaphors. And in fact, Buddhism contains remarkably specific elaborations of the various levels and types of heavens and hells. The heavens, for example, are organized into ecstatic, sensuous realms with form, and more psychologically still and neutral realms that are formless, but nonetheless delightful. However, in spite of these places existing forever as places or dimensions, the beings that abide in heaven and hell do not stay there forever. And that is solely because their minds are still trapped within the condition of existence. This raises a concern with the concept of heaven. Heaven is generally viewed as a version of life that is free of problems, and for Buddhism, it's an existence that endures for an extremely long time, tens of thousands to millions of years just for one being. However, Buddhism doesn't see heaven as the solution to suffering. This is why it holds the perspective between the two extremes of eternalism, which believes in eternal heaven or hell, and annihilationism, the belief that absolutely nothing happens after death and everything finishes. Buddhism doesn't subscribe to the idea of being annihilated upon death, nor does it endorse the notion that just being good or following a specific faith will lead to eternal bliss in heaven. Both of these concepts are rejected. Buddhism offers a very realistic and logical perspective that acknowledges that all situations, both good or bad, are temporary and will eventually change into something else. So the ongoing impermanence of states is the fundamental problem with life. So the second noble truth is the cause of suffering, which is generally said to be craving, or taught as the three poisons within the wheel of samsara, or the bhava chakra. These are ignorance, craving, and aversion. Craving is usually just a form of attachment. So this also applies to the things we strongly don't want, because we carry that sense of attachment to more preferable outcomes. We strongly don't want to lose our job, for instance. So these two polarities of mental states, craving and avoiding, are magnetized states that we allow ourselves to feel because of ignorance. This is what Buddhism believes keeps us trapped in perpetual cyclic existence. And this process is called transmigration, a linear process, with beings beginning evolution in the mineral and plant kingdoms, struggling through the animal kingdom to the heavenly kingdom, slowly passing through it and gradually descending back down again, devolving through the animal kingdom, reaching hell and slowly passing through the purification of hell over the course of hundreds or thousands of years, before revolving back again into a new round of evolution. We continually pass through these realms and experiences, all because of a lack of understanding of this fundamental dilemma that all beings face. It's a dilemma that's caused by existence itself. So clearly, this is not something that one can escape from just by finding a better, fancier existence. The idea of transferring human consciousness into a computer to escape illness and death still carries the same inherent problem of perpetual continuation in existence. The only way to make it work is if you were to somehow ensure that the system could run without hardware and with an operating system that is somehow immune to the inevitable deterioration that entropy produces over time. In essence, ignorance lies in not recognizing the fact that there is absolutely no escape from the predicaments of cyclic existence. This awareness is at the heart of the Four Noble Truths. The third noble truth states that there is a means to the end of suffering. Sometimes we call this the truth of cessation, and the Sanskrit term for this cessation is nirvana. Another synonym for this is nibbana, which is the Pali term used in the Theravada tradition. Although nibbana refers to the cessation of suffering, it's really just the starting point of liberation, since as a psychological state and as a dimensional plane, it's still within the sphere of existence. Therefore, the beings there are subject to change and entropy. But this is where we start in our pursuit of happiness, and from Nibbana onward, there is the possibility of walking completely off the wheel of existence and suffering for good. And also, this initial step toward liberation is something that we realize during life. It's not something that we have to wait for until death. To become a resident of Nibbana simply requires that the mind becomes purified to a high enough degree. And many people in history have attained these heavenly forms of liberation. The Buddha, of course, accomplished this. His enlightenment was attained in one life. And those who don't attain enlightenment during life don't generally know what to expect after death, so it's better to attain a certain level of liberation when one is alive. This is a major distinction from the Christian concept of heaven as an everlasting condition of ease that only occurs after death, as the Buddha does not claim that such infinite realms exist, especially those that are only redeemable after physical death. So the right understanding about liberation is that unsatisfactoriness and suffering can and should be eliminated during life. This is carried out through rigorous psychological work. Now, as for the experience of eternal liberation from suffering by means of escaping existence, many people have asked what happens thereafter. And the Buddha clarifies that there is no continued existence upon reaching this level of enlightenment. And there are also many practitioners of jhana meditation who have experience in escaping the realms of existence. They explain that when a person's consciousness passes through and beyond all the levels of heaven, some of which are known as jhanas, they reach the dimension of non-existence, which is called neither perception nor non-perception, abbreviated as NPNNP. In this state of consciousness, only formations or proto-thoughts, as Delson Armstrong calls them, exist and arise here and there. The only thing that remains are the pre-manifestations of thoughts before their final formation. The only perception is of disconnected images, colors, patterns that are not recognizable. This is one of the most primordial states of consciousness one can abide in. The fourth noble truth states that the method to end suffering is the eightfold path, or middle path. Now, the true meaning and intention of the Four Noble Truths and other scriptures, as Buddhism spread throughout the West, has not surprisingly been diluted and personally tailored as the knowledge was passed on to modern philosophers and writers who've made their own interpretations of the suttas. So in modern times, and particularly in North America, Buddhism is most commonly practiced in a very incomplete and non-religious way. For many people here, Buddhism is treated as a supplemental philosophy that we incorporate into our modern secular lives. Just something to help us with our tendency to get distracted frequently, or something to help us with our everyday anxiety and worries. A guide of ethics and good habits that promote our overall quality of life. We have these very personal and unique applications of Buddhist philosophy because the majority of people here are either brought up as non-religious and scientifically secular or Christian. So this way of practicing Buddhism fits into our lives nice and well, but ultimately has no effect on the problem of continual suffering. So many modern writers who've rewritten Buddhist scriptures in English for us to use have altered the original texts to suit our needs as secularists. And it tends to be that the most crucial and fundamental concepts, such as rebirth, karma, interdependence, heaven, and hell, have been tailored for us with vague, speculative, and metaphoric interpretations that are not congruent with the intentions of traditional Buddhism. This is mostly how it is with Buddhism in the West. Most Buddhists are not monastics. Our society has become so removed from religion and so attached to sensual life that whenever we come across something we don't like in philosophy, we make up the most ridiculous, stubborn excuses to discredit it. We say things like rebirth and hell are just metaphors for certain conditions we find ourselves in. Or we say that this or that line in the Bible must have been sneaked in at some point by power-hungry priests. And I didn't make that one up. I've heard someone say that before. All because he didn't want to admit what the Bible was stating about the broad and narrow paths or roads, which is Matthew 7, lines 13 and 14. Or we say that the Gnostic speaker's teaching is fear-based, even though the organization is non-profit and the teachers are anonymous. So what are they getting out of it? So for this reason, there are numerous movements in Buddhism that are mostly North American creations. I'm not talking about traditional schools of Buddhism like Theravada, Mahayana, Tantrayana. No, these are very new, modern movements, mostly coming from North America, created by many people who, frankly, don't want to grow up and face the reality of traditional Buddhism. So we have agnostic Buddhism, atheistic Buddhism, secular Buddhism, and so on. These movements are flatly in denial of the historical sutta orientation because they attempt to ignore, disregard, and or replace what the suttas say about reincarnation, rebirth, and the perpetual suffering of existence. And it's understandable that writers want to create slightly modified versions of Buddhist scriptures that may be better accepted by Westerners. But there comes a point where the modifications and interpretations really defeat the original purpose of Buddhism. And as for the suttas themselves, they become disgraced by these alterations. In the original suttas, you will find the phenomenon of endless birth and death mentioned hundreds of times in different places. The attitude of the suttas is very severe, and nearly everything is intended to be taken literally. They clearly state that there is no way to get around constant rebirth if one does not follow the complete Dhamma. To be in denial of this, I would say, is somewhat pathetic, because here we have a crucial responsibility regarding the evolution of your soul. And just because we want to enjoy our life, or just because we fear things like hell, we can't admit it, we can't own up to this responsibility of Dharma, and make the lifestyle adjustments required. We'd rather pretend that it's all symbolic. These essential principles are explicit in the suttas. Now, whether or not the suttas are true, the point here is that anyone who denies that these concepts are part of the original teachings of the Buddha has very strong intentions to alter the truth. These days, the suttas are available in English, so anyone can read them. And when you pick some of these up, you can see the very distinct modifications and interpretations made by the writers and philosophers with materialist and annihilationist perspectives. And many Christians identify as Buddhist Christian, where they simply come across Buddhism and they want to somehow reconcile it with Christianity. But due to a lack of investigation, many of them think that Buddhism provides an eternal heaven. These are the two extreme beliefs that have always been around. The middle path claims that the condition of life is very much in between these two views. So the meaning of the eightfold path is quite straightforward if looked at in the context of a spiritual path that one takes. It's only when you learn about how the middle path is supposed to be applied to your attitude and psychology that things become a bit more subtle. But this is not subtle. Ongoing cyclic existence through the 6 realms of life is repeated hundreds and even 1,000 or couple thousand times throughout the enormous collection of the Buddhist scriptures from the Pali Canon.